Rido Plasencia presenta Deportes, Entrevistas.
¿Nos viene a presumir su medalla?
Sí, ha sido...
¿Qué fue lo que falló para
Y mucho más.
El aficionado mexicano es malinchista y vale la pena darle su oportunidad al deporte mexicano.
Stefan Szymanski, how are you?
Hi, very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on your show.
No, there's no problem. And the first question is, why you start to write about sports?
Right, well, it's a slightly different path. It's not really because I was such a sports fanatic. I like sports, but I wouldn't say I was crazy fanatic. But what happened was that as an economist, I got interested in what the data can tell us about competition competition in markets and how different structures of competition affect the outcomes. So really, it was more of an economic motive for getting interested rather than just being a fan.
Are you agree that right now it's such important for any kind of sport, any level of sport, to have a nice economic knowledge?
Well, it's certainly become more useful over time, I think, to understand the economics of the sport. And I know many fans really resent this, that they feel that it shouldn't be a business, that sport is somehow pure and different. But the reality is that professional sports have always involved money. Once you involve spectators who pay for the privilege of seeing a game, then you start to become a business. And so it does help to understand a little bit about what those economic forces are, particularly when it comes to things like evaluating proposed changes, as we saw recently in Europe with the proposed European Super League.
Where are you from?
So I'm originally from London in England. I have a strange background. My mother is English. My father was Polish. I was actually born in Nigeria, in Africa, but I really grew up and spent most of my life in London until I moved to the United States and the University of Michigan 10 years ago.
So you are a citizen of the world.
I like to think so. I certainly think all parts of the world are interesting, and I've traveled a lot and enjoy traveling and seeing how people in different parts of the world come to terms with their sports as well as with many other things.
Living in London, you have the football. In America, it's called soccer. Well, in America, Australia, some other places, it's called soccer. But football, it's a very fan base in England. I was a long time ago there, and I recall being in Brighton and the hooligans in the 90s. As you recall, all the hooligans are part of all the folklore of the football, and they start to share some papers that they are going to be 2 days from the day they gave the papers, because it's gonna be a soccer game between the Brighton team and I don't recall the other. But the question is, that fan base, it's become the main part of the business in sports, right?
Well, I mean, fan bases have always been important in sports. I mean, there is no professional sport without fans. So in some ways, they've always been important. I think part of the worrying trend really in much of sport is for people who run the sport to treat the fans as if they are some like an asset, like something that is not living and breathing. I mean, fans are people, and people have emotions, and the emotion is what drives a lot of the interest in sports. And I think it's dangerous if we forget that. I mean, people often say, "Oh, sports teams are brands." I mean, I think that kind of talk is a bit silly. What really are, they are institutions that deliver entertainment for huge parts of the world's population.
And there's a really strange thing, or a real thing, that sports is the only show that is friendly with the free TV, right? Because all big tours, soap operas are going to translate to the OTTs like Netflix, Amazon, but sports, it's still part of the free TV, the free business, right?
Right. Well, so firstly, I think it's important to say that, football, soccer has been around with us for more than 150 years. And it's really only in the last 30 years that TV has become an important, really the dominant part of the game, the dominant way in which people interact. For more than a century, people's main interaction with soccer was to actually go watch a game in person. Clearly, TV has changed the way in which we think about the game, and it's opened it up to a much bigger audience in a lot of ways. And that audience now really drives the way, to a large extent, in which the game is being organized. And it's certainly true that keeping making that access to TV has become an important instrument in the in the management of television, and I mean, a lot of those games have stayed on free to air, so they're easily available. But in many countries, it's migrated towards pay television, and you still have to have a subscription. I mean, here in the US, I can get it on cable channel, but I mean, it's still, and so, but you're still ultimately paying a subscription for that. So, monetizing sports broadcasting has been sort of one of the main sort of developments which has enriched the sport over many years. Although, again, many people feel that that's not an entirely a positive development.
You talk about soccer and also football. American football has survived, especially college football, without TV from a long time, since the ball era. The TV is a main part of this business.
Yeah, that's right, and it's I mean, it's an interesting question as to how that affects the long-term future of the game. I mean, again, the biggest thing that's happened this year in soccer is the proposal of a European Super League, and it's the withdrawal of that proposal within 2 days, and that was almost entirely driven by the opinion of fans, and most of those fans would have been people who actually attended the game. So the people who go to the games are still really, really important in terms of the future of soccer, even if nowadays they actually generate a much smaller fraction of the revenue. So, for example, in the English leagues, Premier League, something like 80% of the money comes from broadcast revenues, and only 20% of the money comes from the gate. But without the fans in the stadium, as we've seen in the last year, thanks to COVID, it's a very different experience. And I think most people are going to be relieved to get back to a world in which we see fans in the stadium. And I think one thing we've learned to appreciate in the last year is how much they add to the atmosphere and to the enjoyment of watching it on television.
Exactly, and also FIFA want to do the World Cup 2 years with a gap of 2 years. Every 2 years, for me, it's not sane. It's a business, but it's not the right business. You, like in Spanish said, you burn the turkey if you expose too much to the oven, right?
Right. So that is true. I mean, one of the things that's difficult in all sports, I think, is the management of change. So, people like me, as they get older, they look back on the things that they remember from when they were young, and they think that those things were great because life was great when you were young, and you tend to be nostalgic and think that things today aren't as good. And yet, in the end, the young people of today are the future of the sport in the next 50 years, not older people like me. And therefore, sometimes you have to change to adapt to the needs of younger people. And there's certainly, the way that younger people view soccer is really changed a lot. I mean, certainly a lot since I was young. And in many ways, the sport will have to adapt to the way those young people see it. So proposals like FIFA's, biannual World Cup, I personally, I think what I feel about that personally doesn't really matter very much. What really matters is, is this something that will appeal to a younger audience? Will this bring people into the game and make them enjoy it, or will it ultimately drive people away from the game? What is in the best interests of the sport in the longer term? So I think those are the questions you have to deal with. And it's very hard, it's very difficult because we all have our own personal feelings that get wrapped up in what we think is best for the game.
Right. And also electronic sports, right? The video games and the EA sports are becoming part of the youth culture. What is the way that affect traditional sports?
Well, I mean, in some ways, the video games are trying. I mean, the people who organize video game competitions are trying to mimic the way that traditional sport has been organized, and it seems rather strange in a way. So, video games seem more natural played on a computer, and yet now we're seeing people staging events in arenas and stadiums where you go to watch and need to actually be present where they're playing in the same space, which is sort of a strange convergence. The Zoom world we've all got used to in the last year is more like the traditional video game. So in some ways, we're going through an era of transition where people who sports and old sports and new sports are trying to adapt to the technologies that we found and really learning from each other in the way that they go forward. And I think one thing that's certain is, soccer will be different in the future, and all sports will be different in the future, and there's likely to be some convergence between mechanisms for consuming different types of sports, if you will, so that the way in which we watch them they will learn from each other and produce new versions really of the experience going forward.
With your background, you born in Nigeria, and in Nigeria, soccer and rugby are the sports, right?
Not so much rugby. I mean, soccer is dominant a game in Nigeria and most of Africa. I mean, rugby is popular in South Africa, but most of Africa is really soccer country through and through.
Okay, and talking about your books, I read something about it, and you write one that it's the title "Why England Lose," right?
I'm sorry, you're breaking up there. Could you say that again?
You have a book that it's called "Why England Lose," right?
Yeah, well, that was the original title. It was published in 2009 and 2008, and we called it that in England. But in America, we called it Soccernomics. And to be honest with you, actually, the book sold better in the United States than it did in England. And one of the reasons we think is that people don't want to read a book about why their country loses. So we decided, in the end, it was renamed as Soccernomics. But that was the original title, Why England Lose.
And why the first title? Because England always lose in the World Cup?
Well, one thing we wanted to point out was, and part of the idea of the book was to say that many things that people believe much of the conventional wisdom that you see in sports like soccer is not really supported by evidence. And one thing we want to say is that for as far as England fans are concerned, the problem is not really that England lose all the time. It's that England fans have expectations that they should never lose, and that's unrealistic. Then we argued that England actually perform pretty well on average over time. It's just that, they're seldom world beating. And, that's a disappointment because the English expect to win every tournament they enter. And of course, that's created a huge amount of disappointment over the years.
And why the name Soccernomics?
Well, so I am an economist by background. And so really a lot of what I have to say about soccer is seen from the perspective of an economist. And again, it's important to say that's not the only way to look at soccer, but it is a way that can generate insights, I think, and can be useful for many people. And so we wanted to see what sorts of insights come from economics and from data analysis in general. I mean, perhaps today we would call it soccer analytics rather than soccernomics, in the sense that a lot of what we were saying was about the role of the development of analytics, and that's become really much more important in the ways of understanding the game than it was even 10 years ago.
This matter of understand a game with analytics. Baseball do it a long time ago. All the great managers are people of maths and physics and tendencies. Right now, every coach in every sport is a analytic guy, right? The sports analytics. Why?
Well, I think, you're right to point to baseball as the origin of this. And certainly, statistics have always played a significant role in baseball, although, again, that role grew dramatically from the sort of 1980s onwards and was really came to the fore, especially in 2003 with the publication of Moneyball, the book, and which later turned into a film, and which talked about how to use data analysis to generate a winning team. And that's really the interest in analytics from the point of view of the coaching staff, is can analytics help you create a winning team? But in some ways, baseball, the lessons of baseball is really that analytics works well in a game that can be broken down easily into discrete, separate segments. Whereas sports like, and for a sport like soccer, which is a continuous flowing game, it's actually much harder to generate analytical insight. And in many ways, the way in which analytics and data in general have enhanced a sport like soccer is not so much analyzing strategy in the way that it has worked in baseball, but rather in terms of thinking about just sort of more mundane factors like as the fitness of the players, the nutrition of the players, and so forth, where data plays a very important role.
You talk about a nice subject. The health, the athletics, the food that you ate as a player, as a sports player, it's always important. But right now, it's the main difference. I remember the story of the Gatorade, right, with the Florida Gators, and why they always in the third quarter they lose the gap they have. But right now, it's the way you use all these analytics in the right person at the right moment of their career, right?
Right, and one thing is, the science, the biomechanics of playing performance have evolved to such a degree that players' careers are significantly enhanced. and players' ability to perform has grown dramatically again. But when you watch now a game from 20, 30 years ago and watch the players on the pitch, you're kind of surprised at how slow they are, how much space everybody has, because again, really just to do with the levels of fitness and the quality of the training that has gone in now. Players are much more efficient machines than they ever were.
Exactly, they're becoming like a human robot, right?
Well, I mean, there is a robotic aspect to the human personality. I think that, but I do think that points to the big difference as well, which is that, here's an example I like to give people. China has made its way to the top of the Olympic medal table by brute force, by essentially identifying children with the right biomechanics at the age of 7 or 8, sending them away to training camps and training them intensively for 10 years so that they're ready to go out and win an Olympic medal. And that's been incredibly successful. And that really is treating people like robots. Their soccer team is hopeless. And that's despite the fact that the president of China is a huge soccer fan and would love them to have a decent team, but they can't produce it. And it's not that they can't produce fit young men. What is the problem with Chinese soccer is that soccer depends on something else. It depends on that initiative and creativity and flair, which is whether it's instinctive or whether it develops, how it develops is not clear. But certainly, it's not easily coachable. And, you see the same thing in the United States, where the United States men's team are heavily coached, but they are unable to achieve the same kind of individual achievement that we've seen in, say a Messi or Ronaldo. And if you think about, what Messi does or what all the great stars do is something that is utterly unpredictable. And once you can predict a player, you can beat them. And that's one thing is that you can't coach really is unpredictability. How do you teach someone to be unpredictable? It's sort of almost a contradiction in terms. So I think that's one thing that keeps soccer really maintains its attraction in many ways, is that it has this beauty of individualism and the human spirit, which is somehow sometimes missing in some of the other sports.
Right. And if you put this compare Brazil and Germany, two different styles, but two of the best national teams in the world, right? Germany, it's always the strategic and how to say correctly, they are fit to do it, and the Brazilian are, like you said, are like chaos without control.
Right. I mean, certainly, it's hard to imagine. I mean, Brazil has struggled. I mean, Brazil is a sports-mad country, but they have struggled in many ways to compete in other sports, partly because of perhaps some lack of organization or infrastructure in the country. I mean, I don't want to jump on Brazil really here, but I mean, certainly I think it's very striking, the preeminence of the Brazilian soccer team and the perhaps less spectacular performance in other sports. Whereas, and again, contrast that with China and their dominance of Olympic sports and their complete failure in the field of soccer. I mean, I don't want to beat up on the Germans, though. I mean, the Germans produced a lot of very creative and very imaginative players as well. The stereotype as Germans as robots, I think, is completely unfair. I mean, they produce players who are often fabulous to watch and very creative. So I want to push back on that a little bit.
No. I'm not saying that they are robots, but they are more structured football, right? Right. They are the way they play. It's the way it should be played, the game in paper. And the Brazilians are more like how do you say it? Like a crazy and artistic team. They have
Right, and but I think the point about soccer is you need both. I think Brazil has, it's struggled in recent years more than it has in the past, partly because of the lack of organization and structure in the soccer system in Brazil. Whereas, and certainly at times we've seen German teams struggle because they've just become too predictable. And if you want to see, being English, I would use England as an example. I mean, one of the problems of England throughout its over many years, many decades, is being completely predictable as to what they're going to do next, and they're easy and therefore easy to beat. But again, you think of the great teams that they have. These stars who are, again, you think of the Maradonas of the world, you think of the Zidanes, and you don't know what they're going to do next, and that is the mystery and the wonder and the genius of soccer as a game, I think.
England has Michael Owen. Remember, he was a great player.
Yeah, and of course, but the greatest thing about Michael Owen was when he came on against Argentina and scored that goal that nobody was expecting. It was just a complete shock. Because he was so new, nobody knew that he was capable of doing such a thing. And I think that's often the case. I think again, to talk about the England memories that people like me have. And remember the famous goal against Brazil of John Barnes in the 1980s, who weaved his way through half a dozen Brazilian defenders to put the ball in the net. And that was a highly celebrated goal. And again, because it was unexpected, it was an Englishman doing what we normally expected to see Brazilians doing. And again, I come back to this again. A lot of what soccer is about the unexpected, and that's in some ways what makes it such a truly great game.
You work in a university that has many sports and sports tradition, but not in soccer. Why in America, in the United States, soccer is just another sport, not the sport?
Well, you always have to be a little bit careful when you say that. American women's soccer is a world beater. They are the best in the world by far, and have been for many years, and so they are in that. So that they can produce truly great soccer players. I mean, it's certainly true to say that they are, the men's game is well behind and struggling to develop. And, partly that's a reflection of the fact that, kids in schools in America want to play basketball, they want to play baseball, they want to play football, and soccer really generally comes, in terms of ambition, it's everybody learns to play soccer at school, but it doesn't particularly seem to be, for boys at least, to be, something to aspire to in the longer term. But that is changing now, and that is clearly changing with, and partly that's to do with the way that kids grow up. And I would say a big part of that actually is our PlayStation games. So I think, and I always give this example. My children, when I lived in the UK still, grew up, knew all about American football by playing the Madden PlayStation game. And likewise, lots and lots of American kids now are very well informed about global soccer because they play the FIFA game. And that, I think, is translating into an interest later on in life. A lot of kids are actually turning that into interest of watching the real game. And so I think we will see a generation of Americans grow up taking the game more seriously. Of course, we already at the moment, the last couple of years, we've seen a few Americans start to emerge on the European scene, and obviously Christian Pulisic is a great example. But it's likely, it seems likely to me, in the longer term there will be more, and it is going to become. It's never going to be the dominant sport, or not in my lifetime anyway. But I think it will grow and become a sport that is of if anything comparable level of interest to the other major league sports.
You put the women in the dock, and why women professional sports are not so fine against the men?
Well, there are clearly physical differences which account for some of these differences, but I think the bigger point here is, why is women's soccer not as popular as men's soccer, and why does women's soccer struggle to generate the same level of interest? And we could argue about lots of sports, but in soccer, I think there's one very simple explanation. Women's soccer was banned for 50 years. That ban was imposed in England in 1920 by the English Football Association, and really became a global ban on women playing soccer for half a century. And if you exclude anybody for that length of time, you're going to slow down their development. And why I would make the contrast, compare women's tennis, which, again, generally, if the best men play against the best women, the best men will tend to win. But nonetheless, there is a huge amount of interest in women's tennis. It generates a huge amount of revenue. It's a major sporting activity. And if women's soccer hadn't been banned for 50 years, I think women's soccer would have could easily have risen to a comparable level of interest. And what I hope now is going to happen is that women's soccer will continue to grow. It is growing very clearly. It deserves a good deal of financial support from FIFA and the other sports authorities, precisely because of the exclusion that women suffered for so long. There's a form of reparations really that are required, but I believe that with that financial support, women's soccer will become, like women's tennis, a strong and popular and important part of the overall sport.
But still the prices aren't the same. In the Wimbledon, men's get more money than women.
Well, the prizes have been equalized to a much greater extent than they were in the past. I don't know the exact numbers for the prizes at Wimbledon. I thought they were now more or less at parity, but I don't have the data to hand.
I don't have also the data, but they are not equal. Right now, they're not equal.
Well, I think, like I say, if you go back 20, 30 years, there was a huge difference, and those differences have been significantly eroded. And so, I mean, women's fight to achieve equality has been a long-term one, right? I mean, they had to get the vote, they had to get the right to private property, they had to get control of, they had to fight discrimination in the workplace. Women have struggled to achieve a level of equality over the years, and they have faced significant discrimination along the way. And so these things take time, and we're not at the end of the road yet by any means. But I think I would say, particularly in soccer, we see quite encouraging signs in the last couple of years. Not there's still a long way to go, but I think women's soccer will grow, and I hope it will, because I think it is. I mean, I certainly watch it from time to time and find it very, it's a perfectly compelling spectacle, and women are playing to an increasingly high standard, as far as I can see.
Yeah, they made very great games in the World Cup. You're from England, so why people from England get mad when you said, soccer? No, football. Why? They put that name on the football soccer and football rugby in the beginning.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a mystery to me as well. It's such a mystery to me. I actually wrote a book about it with Silke Weineck. We wrote a book which is called "It's Football, Not Soccer," which tries to explore how this happened. And it's a very, very strange story, because soccer is a word that was coined in England at Oxford University, we think. And we have evidence that this was true going back more than 100 years. So we're pretty sure that this word comes from England. And in fact, what got me interested in the question was, I'm old enough to remember back in the 1970s when people in England still called it soccer, and that was deemed perfectly acceptable. In fact, you'll still find people in England who refer to it as soccer. But what seems to have happened is that soccer only really came to in the United States only really came to be to international attention in the 1970s. It had always been played in America, but people in the rest of the world didn't know even that anybody played it. They kind of thought that nobody played it, which wasn't true. But there was a successful league in the 1970s and early 80s called the NASL, which Pelé played in, and a lot of European stars played in. And this league got a lot of attention in Europe because people heard that Americans were playing this, heard that game was called soccer, which is a word that they had taken from the English, and which they used to distinguish it from their version of football. And so then suddenly there was this reaction in England, especially, of saying, well, you can't call it soccer, the proper name is football. Almost, it seems, actually forgetting that the word had originally come from England. And I've had arguments with English people saying, this word comes from England, and I've given them evidence and shown them documents, and they say, no, it's an American word. And it's a really strange kind of psychological, it's a kind of like an illness, really, and it's born really out of anti-Americanism. It's really just a manifestation of anti-Americanism, which is pretty dumb, to be honest. It's just dumb,
yes,
but funny too.
Yes, because you can call soccer football. Even in Argentina, they put football. No, with the tile, and nobody said nothing. But the funny thing is, the football is called football because the ball it's a foot long. The football in American football, it's called because the ball is a foot long. That's the meaning of football, not because they play with the foot.
Oh well, no, I'm not having that. No, that's a myth. But you should read my book. You should read the book. It's called "It's Football, Not Soccer," and it will tell you the history of this. And yes, one of the stories is that the ball's a foot long, but that's not really the story. And the real story is that there was a game of football in England played going back at least 1,000 years. We have historical records about this. But the point is that the rules of this game varied depending which town you were in. They varied from town to town. And they played many versions of this game. And some versions looked like what we now call football in England or in much of the world, or what we call soccer here in America. And some of them look like what American football, the football they play in America. And some of them look like Australian rules football, which is the football they play in Australia. And some of them look like rugby football, which is played in England and South Africa and New Zealand and other countries. So there were all these versions of the game that evolved over hundreds of years, and different parts of the world codified these rules in the 19th century, and they all had the name football. And one of the reasons why soccer was coined in England was specifically to distinguish it from rugby football, which actually looks more like the American version of football. So football, rugby and soccer were two names that were actually coined in England to distinguish the two, and which is what Americans do today. You call one game soccer and the other football in order to tell them apart, which is a pretty sensible thing to do.
Right, like Italians call it calcio.
But don't get me started on that. And of course, the Italians, the Italians call it calcio because they refused to accept that the rules of the game were originally written down in England, and they were really trying to claim that it had been invented in Italy. And of course, the truth about this is that every civilization and every culture going back thousands of years has had some kind of a game where they kicked a ball. I mean, that's there's only so many things you can do with a ball. you can kick it, you can hit it with a stick, you can throw it. There are limits to what you can do. But the rules of the game that we know as soccer were originally written down in London in 1863 by the Football Association. And we have records of that, and we know that that's true. So again, the Italians invented the name calcio to try to pretend that they invented it. And of course, the Chinese also now claim that they invented it. And they did have a game which involved a ball which you kicked, but it wasn't soccer. It wasn't the game that we know today. So there's these origin stories and claims to originate these games. These are sort of a hotly contested historical debate. But and again, we wrote this book in order to try and at least sort of shed put some clarity behind this.
I'm going to get the book. It's on Amazon?
Yes, it is. It's Futbol, Not Soccer, and it's by myself and Zilka Maria Weineck.
I'm going to get it. And also in Mexico we have a ball game, but they kick, well, no kick, they shake the ball with the hips.
Right, and so no, exactly. There are traditional, and there were traditional Aztec ball games, which we know from the historical record existed. Of course, part of the problem there is we don't know what the original rules were of these games, and of course, you could say there is just generically worldwide there are families of ball games, and to argue about who came up with them first is a bit silly in the sense of like I say, every culture. People have played with balls in one way or another. The point is that the rules of the games in the modern era, that we have a fixed sort of set of games that have emerged that are popular for spectators. Soccer is the most popular. American football is probably the second most popular. Then you have rugby football. You have Gaelic and Australian rules football, and one or two others, but those are really the main versions of the games of football that have become established in the modern era.
And talking about economics, the league that know how to make more money, it's the NFL. More than the FIFA, more than everybody, they know the showbiz and they know how to make money, right?
Well, yes, that's true. They have. In many ways, they sort of piggybacked on the success of the dominance of college football in the United States. Of course, there are many more college football teams than there are NFL teams, obviously, and the place of football in the American psyche really has to do much more with the college game rather than the NFL. What the NFL did was successfully in the television era really grasp that potential, and they have, yes, as you say, they've been particularly commercially very, very successful. Although again, globally, the amount of money that the NFL makes is small compared to really the amount of money that soccer makes. What the Americans have done is to concentrate that revenue in the hands of a small number of people. And whether that's good for a sport to be dominated by a small number of teams and people, that's an interesting question. It's dominant in the United States, but it really struggles everywhere else in the world. Whereas soccer really doesn't struggle anywhere. It's pretty successful everywhere you go. So in some ways, Americans have had a narrow success domestically, but you wonder if that, in the longer term, whether that's really going to be that success will continue, given the pressures of globalization.
And talking about globalization, basketball is doing his work also with the NBA, and they have many associations around the world.
That's right. But again, the difference between the NFL and the NBA really is that the NFL, for American football, there is no infrastructure anywhere else in the world to speak of to support the game, so that there's no local interest based on local teams. Basketball is completely different. There is a world federation that is very significant. There are thriving leagues across Europe, in South America, in China, in other parts of the world, and that really underpins a global interest. And again, in the end, we tend to focus on the biggest businesses, but what really matters in the end is the infrastructure of support for the game as a whole, and that's much more developed in basketball.
Okay, Stefan, it's a nice talk, and I know you have work to do. I want to thank you for this interview. It's a pleasure for me to talk about the sports and the world of sports, and I hope to do another time. But first, I'm going to read your book.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and it's been a pleasure chatting. It's been lovely. Thank you for having me on.
Your social media for the audience in this podcast?
Oh, so I'm on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @SSZY.
Okay. Well, I'm going to put it in the venue of this talk. Thank you, and I hope we can talk another time. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
Te recordamos, síguenos semana a semana. Estamos en Twitter, @RigoPlasencia. Gracias por tu atención.